Now, imagine that you walked into a room and the room was dark and you needed to do something important in the room. Now, what you would do is you'd look for the light switch and you'd turn it on. And for you, this would seem like the most natural thing to do. Flip a switch. Most switches, most mundane switches, come with only two options. It's either you switch it on or you switch it off. The basic notion of switching on and off is what we call 1 and 0 because it's a binary action. It is the basis upon which all digital phenomena is constructed. So that when you have something like a microchip, for instance, it contains billions of transistors. Billions and billions of transistors. And each transistor is basically a switch. So it's switching on or it's switching off. Now, when you have patterns on and off, aggregates of patterns of on and off, you can literally encode complex behaviors on an aggregate level. And in some sense, this is how self-consciousness in a human is generated, because we have neurons in our brains and each neuron fires an electric potential, that's electricity, or it doesn't fire. So in the terminology, it's called polarization and depolarization. So most of cells, your brain cells, or most of your nerve neurons, of signaling cells like that, they exist in a polarized state. And when a stimuli comes in that involves them, then they depolarize suddenly, which means they are able to release electrical energy very suddenly. We depend on this for life, Think of the autonomic pacemaker cells that are responsible for your heartbeat. If those cells suddenly stop working, then the heart stops beating, essentially. And you have a lot of cells like that all over the human body, alright? And most of them are autonomic in the sense that they do not require our active participation to get them to fire. I've just given you an example with the cardiac pacemakers. But also in your brain, you also have cells like that, brain cells like that, neurons that fire based on sensorial inputs. And this is very important because your neurons are patterned around your sense organs. You have different parts of the brain that receive predominance of information from a singular sense organ. For instance, your visual cortex is at the back of your head. Alright? And the reason for this is because that visual information is now calibrated and transmitted into another type of experience, which we call a digital sense in itself. Like your vision literally has some digital aspects to it, but it's really just electricity. And when it comes down to electricity, it's fire or don't fire. At least when it comes to neuronal cells. And this is very important for this podcast I'm trying to give, because the podcast is how Gemini generates Venus. So it's a Venus in Gemini podcast. Alright? And if you've listened to me for the last 3 minutes, I've already given you a hint that Venus in Gemini really is Gemini's ability to produce the vector that Venus is known for. That's really what it is, because Venus, in a nutshell, is a vector. And the vector is designed to point to what you want the most, or what you like the most. Now, various aspects in terms of the placement of Venus and its aspect to other bodies in your natal chart tell you about this vector, about this way of wanting things, this way of seeking pleasure, this way of being loved, this way of perceiving beauty, this way of what you find to be harmonious or pleasurable. Right? And now Gemini needs to produce this. But first of all, it's time to delve into the nature of Venus. What exactly is Venus? When I say that Venus is a vector, what exactly do I mean? Now, Venus is a vector, and it is that aspect of our consciousness that allows us to decide or to choose what it is that we like. And the process of choice is always the same. It involves sampling. And that's what Venus does. It's your connection to reality. And as human beings, we connect to reality via our sense organs. So we're talking about the sense of sight, vision, the sense of audition, which is a sense of hearing, or the sense of olfaction, which is our sense of smell, the sense of taste or gustation, and the sense of touch or tactition. Now, the important thing about these sense organs is that that's the way we couple to a reality. Without the input from these sense organs, we might as well be brains in a jar. Because the sense organs allow us to know that there is a reality and that we are part of it. So that you can look at these sense organs as integrations into reality. But if you have to be genuine about what you're looking at, you will immediately realize that these sense organs are no different from the reality that they are experiencing. And it has to be so that there is a seamless flow of information between whatever that reality is supposed to be and what it is that you are picking up and how you are picking it up. The idea is to create a continuous spectrum in some sense, so that there's really no distinction. Now, whatever that reality is, right, whatever it is really made of, or however it is formed, we cannot know except through these sense organs. So if you switch off all your sense organs, then how do you know that you are? How do you know that you are alive? You need a reality. And if you've been listening to my podcast, I always equate these realities to narratives. Because the thing that is really being acquired by these sense organs is a narrative. And in order to be able to formulate the type of narrative that a reality is, you need to be able to populate that narrative, meaning that the actual narrative is coming from you, some way or somehow. You are populating the narrative that you call a reality. And these sense organs simply validate this population. Now, if you have a dissonance between the population and the sense organs, that's the nature of insanity. So every wakeful moment, what we are doing is we are constantly reconciling the internal narrative that is emanating from our state of conviction, right, with what we consider to be an external reality. And this is very important when we meet people. Whenever we meet people, because people carry realities. Every human being carries a reality in their head, which is their own story, the narrative they're telling themselves. Alright? And the interesting thing about these narratives is that they're not taking place from one point in the human. They're taking place as part of an infinite spectrum. So at every layer of your existence, and its infinity, at every layer of that, there is a narrative. The deeper that narrative goes, the less you are in control of it. Until you get to the point where, for instance, you are a single cell in your body. A single cell that is taking instructions from its environment and responding in a very complex manner. Yet, you cannot reconcile your self-consciousness to that single cell, because there are 50 trillion of them on average in your body. So which one exactly are you? The sense of self that you experience is only available on an aggregate level. That is, each of these, you have maybe 85 billion neurons in your brain. And so those neuronal cells are wired to every other part of your body. So you can imagine them as an aggregate center. And that's exactly what one of the function of your thalamus in your head. It kind of aggregates all these sense organs into one point, so that it is from there that you now begin to feel a sense of self. But what it really is an aggregation from trillions and trillions of inputs that are being generated on a micro level or a cellular level. And it goes beyond that, because the cell is just molecular machinery. And then you get to the level of molecules, and then you get to the level of atoms, and then you get to the level of subatomic particles. So which one really are you? The answer is that you are everything. Because what you are is organized complexity. It's a scheme. It's an organizational strategy. Human existence is the process by which that strategy comes together into a being that can now sense an environment. But at every layer of this beingness, as I've described it from subatomic level all the way to the aggregate that you are, there is a narrative associated with all of it. That's really what it is. On the level of that aggregate, where you experience a sense of self, right, you are using that sense of self to try to determine where you want to go, what you want to do. That process of determining what you want to do or where you want to go, that's the Venusian instinct. That's the Venusian functional light. And the idea is that on an aggregate level like that, if you can perceive what you like or where you want to go, then you can use that to sculpt the narrative on that level. Because, for instance, if you like fruits, for instance, okay, so whenever you see where there are fruits, it is most natural for you to gravitate towards that direction, to go in that direction. Now, there's a reason why you like what you like, because that Venusian function is not alone. It is in a complex harmonic relationship with everything else in your natal chart, which is basically a way of saying everything else in your psychology. Because on that level, on that aggregate level, you experience yourself as one. Okay, that's the whole point of bringing all that information together from trillions and trillions of places and then aggregating it so that you perceive it as a sense of oneness. There's a reason for that. Because that sense of oneness, that is the divinity that is within you. And the essence of that divinity that you perceive within you, that oneness that you perceive within you, is so that you can perceive that oneness external of you. And by perceiving that oneness external of you, evil disappears from the world. Because you realize that the external reality is you. That's the essence. That's the reason why you are made in the way that you are made. And so that's what natal chart synthesis is. It's not analysis. It's the synthesis of everything together, bringing it all together and understanding it on that aggregate level. Because it's on that level, it is more than the sum of its parts. And the Venusian function is that vector that emerges from that points you in a particular direction. Because it is a sum total of everything else coming together to determine what it is that you like. So that instinct of what I like is meant to lead you to your destiny. It's meant to lead you to the reason why you are here. That's why the sign of Taurus, that's Venus rules, right, is extremely important, because outside of Aries, which is just the entry into a reality, that is the bursting forth into a reality, well, that bursting forth needs to be implemented as something. It needs to take form, structure. It needs a direction. Because Aries doesn't have any direction. Alright? It's just the readiness to act and the energy available to act. But it is the Venus that gives you the direction. Just imagine a 360-degree sphere. A three-dimensional sphere. From the center of the sphere, there are almost an infinite number of possible directions that the arrow can point to. How do you know which one is yours? Or how do you know where you're supposed to go? But that Venusian function is what tells you which direction you're supposed to go. And if you come to understand it, it is listening to everything else in your life, everything else in your natal chart. Is giving that Venus what it wants. And so the Venus comes about as the way that you like to be loved in one instance. It also means the way that you enjoy pleasure. And the pleasure instinct is your biology telling you that this is what is best for you. Because in order to get to that level, it is summing the input of trillions and trillions and trillions of connections. Just to be able to aggregate it to the level where you can understand it as a singular vector. And so, do you know the implication of going against that vector? Of literally going in the opposite direction? You harm yourself. You harm yourself. You harm your life. You harm your path forward. And usually these types of going against your vector, it's usually hard-coded in the natal chart because it's probably tied to something else that you need to experience. Because of the very important nature of that Venusian vector, right? A lot of life lessons are always tied to it. Because it is the beginning of the journey. Think about getting out of your house. You want to go somewhere. Well, how do you know whether you need to go left or right or up or down or wherever? You don't know once that Venus is malfunctioning. But once you know where you're supposed to go and you can understand it and feel it very clearly, then that agreement is a harmonization of all your life. Because in order to produce that Venusian instinct, everything is harmonized within you. That is, the trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of data points, they are harmonized and synchronized. And that's why you experience it as pleasure. And so when a human being is born, they are born with this instinct already within them. Do you know, in the last trimester of pregnancy, you know how much construction is taking place in the brain? And when the child is born, then a recalibration begins to take place almost immediately, because there are too many connections already laid down. Some will not be needed. So that the point of birth, the ascendant, begins to recalibrate the potential that the individual is already born with. And the reason why it's doing that is so that it can narrow down on the vector. Because you are born into a reality system that is supposed to trigger that vector immediately. And that is why the infant child is born with the aptitude for suckling. Because that is Venus, that is Taurus. The first instinct is the sense of taste. That's really what it is. That sense of taste is the one that lights up or leads the other senses into that calibration. Because what's really going on is what I like, what I don't like. And what you like is what you tend to move towards. And once you have significant placements of Venus or Taurus or whatever, then the work being done is you need to find all those things that you like and create a datum, which is a fixed reference point for pleasure. And then you plant your flag there. And that's it. It's a process that happens very early naturally, right? But most people with significant placements in Taurus or with Venus very prominent in their natal, right? When they find this datum, they fix it there and it doesn't move anymore. Why should it? Because it is the first thing that you really understand. So what are you moving it to? That's why people who have significant placements in Taurus, they don't move. They're very obstinate. Because why? Why should they? They sample a lot of information before they actually find that sweet spot. And that sweet spot acts as a guidance for them for everything they have ever done. So why should they move? Alright? So that is the Venusian quality. It's a very wonderful quality in the human, because it's not just a sense of pleasure. There's meaning attached to that pleasure, because that pleasure point, that sense of pleasure, which starts with a sense of taste, really. Okay? So respect your tongue. One of the things that first informed you of the type of reality that you were born into. Okay? And then you built your sense of self really around that sense of taste. Most people don't realize this. Alright? You find there are some people who have an extraordinary sense of taste. In terms of the variations that they can taste, and in terms of the type of food they're drawn to, and that sense of taste is closely followed by the olfactory sense, the sense of smell. And when you find people who have very sophisticated sense of smell and taste, wow, there's a certain pleasure that they bring into life because they know how to connect with it. Because once those two are functioning correctly, the sense of vision follows as a close third. And so you find people with highly developed Venusian placements, right, to have this particular aesthetic quality to them. They understand what looks good, what tastes good, right, what sounds good. And usually these are the things that we look for in reality to arrange them, because when things look very, very good, especially in the type of societies that we have today, people are drawn to them. Because they look very beautiful. They look good, in terms of when you impress upon those types of things, or when you connect with them, they give you a feeling of goodness in terms of this must be good. I'm drawn to it. Maybe good music, good food, or even opportunities that are packaged in such a way that they look very fulfilling. That's the power of Venus. That's why the Venusian quality is the power to harmonize things. The similarity between things, to link them together into a much grander sense of meaning. Now let's examine the sign of Gemini. Now the interesting thing about the sign of Gemini is that it is symbolized by a contrast. That's why Gemini represents the nature of twins, in the sense of one twin is staring in the left direction, the other twin is staring in the right direction. Why? Why this symbolism? It's because Gemini is basically a transistor. It's basically a switch. So either it is off or it is on. Now it cannot function without these two aspects. It needs that contrast. And because of that, when Gemini needs to produce Venus, it is talking about a Venus that is there sometimes and a Venus that is not there some other times. Now, you would say, what does this mean? It means that at some point you know what you want, and at some point you negate that which you know that you want, so that you become your own opposition. That's the way the vector works once it finds itself in Gemini. It must be what it is, and then it must negate what it is. Because it is from that type of dynamism that it derives its ability to move forward. So when you have a Venus in Gemini, you may like something today, but you also like the fact that you can not have that thing. Now, you may not be consciously aware of that other part. You may think that what you like is what you like persistently, but that's not the way Venus in Gemini works. It works by surrounding itself with the possibility of negation. So even if you love somebody, you do not love them persistently. You love them sometimes today, and tomorrow you don't love them anymore. And then the very next day you love them equally again. And that's the way that your vector functions. It is designed to negate itself. Now, the negation itself is not the end of the vector itself, right? It's just the switching on and off of it. And the reason for that is to generate that potential that we described in neuronal cells, which is polarize or depolarize, fire or don't fire. And we all know what that does in the brain. The aggregate behavior of neurons behaving in that way is what allows us to generate consciousness. That's really what it is. So the equivalent of consciousness would be what? Knowledge. So the Venus in Gemini really is concerned with knowledge about reality, about the world, about its surroundings, especially its immediate surroundings. And the emphasis on the immediacy of those surroundings comes from the fact that what the Gemini sign receives is information from Taurus. Gemini comes after Taurus. And what Taurus generates is a sense of pleasure or displeasure. And when Gemini receives this, it creates its own contrast. So, pleasure, is it available or is it not? And it has to be this way because that is the ability to trigger thinking. Because until something is negated, you really don't know that it's there. That's how our minds work, at least in this reality. When we perceive something, it's because we perceive the absence of that thing simultaneously. The possibility of its absence is what allows us to think of that thing in ways that are able to be represented in the brain, in the mind. So you cannot really appreciate someone until you miss them. That's a typical feature of Venus in Gemini. Because for you, that pleasure vector exists as this transient between an off and on state, meaning that it exists as an intellectual part of yourself. You have to be able to think about the pleasure vector, and it is from the ability to think of this pleasure vector, that's how the vector gets its dynamism. Because remember, the dynamism of that vector, which is Venus, is that it leads you to what you want. It's a map of some kind, an internal state, because living things tend to move towards that which they find pleasurable, and they move away from that which they find displeasurable. It's a natural instinct, a natural impulse. Now, the way it works in the Venus in Gemini is that it's an off and on switch. So it moves towards something that it wants, but then it's also in love with the idea of not having that thing, because that's what really does it for it. It has to be able to consider the negation of that thing so that it can generate the intellectual response, which is where it finds that Venus. It must take everything about the world. It must take it and then generate the negation of that thing, the possibility of that negation, or the actual negation of it, so that it can think about it. Now, when it thinks about it in that way, it derives a sense of pleasure from it. It's appealing to it. And so the Venus in Gemini has often been accused of having an intellectual disposition to love. And you know what they say? The pleasure vector itself is not very dynamic. It's either pleasure or displeasure. The intellectual vector is more dynamic. It is. Because you can have pleasure off and on. You can have displeasure off and on. So you can play with different permutations of these things. And that creates a more or a richer sense of intellectual experience about that which you find pleasurable. So that you can have different permutations, different combinations. And that's what takes the Venus into the realm of the intellectual mind, especially in the immediate surroundings. Because the sense of pleasure or the sensorial inputs that feed into Gemini, they come from the physical senses. Your human senses. And your human senses are the things that allow you to know that you are in an environment, and then allow you to calibrate the nature of that environment such that you move towards the things that you like, and then you move away from the things that you do not like. And this is what Gemini receives, and it begins to intellectualize about this. Why? Because there are some things in that environment that are there today and they're not there tomorrow. This is what the Venusian in Gemini notices the most. It notices these contrasts. So if you're loving such a person and your desire to love such a person is featured as a constancy in that person's life, then you're going to create a lot of problems for them. They do not expect you to be there all the time. They expect you to be off and on because they are off and on. They need to be able to think about your presence. They need to be able to think about your absence. Now, it's not hurting them. That's the way they understand the world. All right? And so sometimes they are described as coming across as flirtatious or being more in love with the idea of love itself than physical love itself. But what does physical love mean? Everything that you experience really gets interpreted by your brain. It's some type of electrical signal in your brain. So at some level of your being, you are making decisions, intellectual decisions about these things. And most of it is related to your immediate environment. The Venus in Gemini is just more honest about this. Alright? So they are able to maintain simultaneous relationships. Why? Because each one represents an intellectual puzzle that excites them. They are drawn to such puzzlings of the mind. They are drawn to individuals that exhibit these types of things. Okay? Because they need to be able to think about what you mean to them. And they need to be able to think about it on a level that matches all the aspects on the placements of that Venus in Gemini. So, they are more in love with your ability to think. Your ability to use your mind. Wittiness, for instance. They're drawn to witty people because they themselves are witty, or they like to think so. They're drawn to intellectual discourses and intellectual pursuits, not because of the structure or underlying meaning. They're drawn to the fast-paced nature of it. The fact that it can flow and move because they understand it better. They understand it better. It gives them a sense of pleasure. The versatility of topical understanding serves as a discussion point for them. It allows them to engage in conversations with different kinds of people and to come across as being intelligent. So they can know a lot about a lot of topics, but only on the surface level. They never really understand the internal nature of the logic that holds everything together, because these understandings are meant for conversation purposes, because they like to be able to flow in and out of different relationships at will. They like that they can do this, okay? And so that's why they cultivate this broad knowledge base. But they never really know enough of anything to really become a major powerhouse in anything, really. It's all for conversation purposes. And the reason why this happens is because it allows them to get what they want. They can come off as freeloaders sometimes. People who only use people to get what they want. These are the games that the mind plays, you understand? It's just part of their nature that eventually they need to outgrow. Alright? These are some of the challenges. There is some downside to taking the Taurian function, which Venus symbolizes, and then embedding it in a function that is one step further evolved into the realm of Gemini, where these contrasts live. Because the contrasting nature of Gemini is designed to stimulate the mind. Alright? Because that's the way the mind works. It requires a contrast to be able to gauge the interval between things. And so Gemini is concerned with those intervals, so that the reality that Gemini occupies exists as a reconciliation of those intervals. If there is a good, there must be a bad somewhere. Otherwise, the mind does not understand what you're talking about. If there is a big, there must be a small. And it is also the case with the Venusian function. If there is something that they like, then there must be something that they dislike. Otherwise, they do not understand what the likeness is, what the vector is. So if there's a vector that points in one direction, there must be another vector with equal probability that points in the opposite direction. And it is only with the existence of these two vectors, they are antipodal to each other, or they are opposite of each other. It is only because these two vectors exist like this, that's the only way that the Venus in Gemini is able to calibrate their reality. And because one of these vectors is the apparent one, it's not really there, but it exists because the original vector must find its own negation, so that things make sense to the Venus in Gemini. Now, because one of it is apparent, it means that there is an aspect of the reality of these people that is not real. It's completely made up. It's in the mind. And this is what allows the Venus in Gemini to play these types of games. At least that's the way it looks to other people who don't have this functional light in Gemini. The holders of this placement, they may come across as insensitive because it appears as if they are playing with the feelings of other people. Now, that is not their intention. They just simply don't understand reality any other way. And this functional light has been given to them in Gemini for a reason that is patterned across the entire natal chart. Remember, these are not standalone functions. These are not standalone functional lights. They exist for a reason. Now, Venus in Gemini is placed for a reason that corresponds to all the other placements in the natal chart. So it must never be looked at in isolation. This apparent placement of vectors and vector opposites, they are related to the story of this natal chart. If you don't have that placement, then the entire narrative that is the synthesis of that natal chart falls apart. So in that sense, there are no good or bad placements. There's no such thing. Every placement is designed to be what it is, to bring about a functional good. And that is the narrative behind everybody's life. Now, that's the plan. The implementation is something else, because most times, more often than not, we do not understand what this narrative is. We look out into reality, trying to study the universe, trying to study the world, trying to understand everything. When the reality of the matter is that those things don't exist. The only thing we are trying to understand is ourselves. And the mechanism our minds derived to understand the self is by projecting it as an external reality. So when we look for understanding in different discourses, you may study music, you may study physics, you may study chemistry, but that's not what you're really studying, because those things don't really exist. You are studying yourself. That's really what it is. I mean, I've said this so many times across all my podcasts. I've provided enough reasons for it to demonstrate this, but The realization that this is what you're doing comes only when you have self-knowledge. And that's exactly what natal chart synthesis is designed to provide. That insight into the structure of your own narrative. Because that narrative, the structure of it, that is what you call a reality. So all your problems, all your benefits, all your joys, all your sadness, all your happiness, all your family, all your whatever it is that you think that you know about reality, there is no such thing. What you know is the projection of that self that is inside you, the way that it sits inside you. That's the only thing that you are knowing about. It's the only thing that you really have access to. Because you cannot jump outside of your physical body or outside of your material senses. You cannot jump out, you cannot become somebody else to know what that person is feeling. That person and everything else will only exist as part of your own mental construct. There is simply no other way. The more apparent this becomes to you, the more you understand what this placement of Venus in Gemini really is. Because that is what the Venus in Gemini person is really dealing with. Pleasure and reality to them is a mental construct. And Venus itself is a sensational construct. It's not really mental in that sense. Okay? Taurus flows into Gemini so that you understand what your senses are saying. You derive information from your senses. But those sense organs themselves, they remain in the realm of pleasure or displeasure, in various forms, that is. They are calibrating the reality around you, but you must send that information to Gemini to make sense of it, otherwise, no dice. So that when Venus finds itself in Gemini, it is a merger of Taurus and Gemini. And that, my dear friends, is the nature of temptation. Because when these two things come together, in the form of either Venus in Gemini or a conjunction between Mercury and Venus, the result is temptation. Why? Because all the possibilities of Venus are now interpreted in the reality of Mercury or Gemini. That is in the intellectual space. And in that space, the nature of understanding is to create opposites, to create dualities, so that we can play with them. Because that is the way that we're able to understand reality. But since there's no reality, that is the way that we're able to understand ourselves. Alright? And when this process begins to go wrong, we see it as a war between these dualities. There's no war between a duality. One vector exists because the other vector exists. And one of them is apparent. It's like a mirror image. And the reason why it exists is because we need the contrast. We need to be able to see ourselves in a mirror. Why? Because the placement of our eyes does not allow us to see ourselves. That is, to look at ourselves. We cannot see ourselves, but we can see the entirety of the world in front of us. Do you think that design is a coincidence? It is not. It was designed that way so that the only people who can really see you are others that you think are external of you. So that you can see another person, but you cannot see yourself. The same thing for that other person. And that means that everybody's true perception of themselves is outsourced to what you call the other. And the reason for that is because there is really no other. It's one of the things that humanity struggles with to understand. Because they think there's an other. And so you set up all these games of competing with the other, denying the other, harming the other. But you might as well do the opposite. You might love the other. You can help the other. You can decide to be kind to the other. But there is no other. Whatever you decide to do, you are doing to yourself. But you don't know this because you cannot understand existence that way. Now, when Venus is placed in Gemini, your life lesson revolves around coming to understand this nature of reality. You will play enough games, engage in enough temptations to utterly and totally confuse yourself, and then watch those games begin to backfire, because there is no reality out there. The reality that you experience in your mind really is coming from you. These things play out in various forms in the natal chart. They are embedded in various forms so that they come across to the individual as various forms of what? Intellectual projections. This is often done in concert with the moon and the 7th house of Libra, so that there exists this ability to project something that looks as if it's external of you. But there is no such thing. And so until the Venus in Gemini learns and understands this, they will continue to engage with the opposite that they create as if it exists outside of themselves. And this can be a long drawn out battle. Have you ever seen certain types of creatures when they come in contact with a specular mirror where they can get to see themselves for the first time? They don't know what they're looking at. For them, it looks like it's another animal or another creature. and they react as such. That's really what it is. Okay? At some point in time, the animals learn not to react anymore. It's not because they understand what they're looking at. It's because they just come to the realization that, yes, there's another creature there, but it doesn't really do anything to me. Even if it takes on an aggressive posture, it doesn't really do anything. They learn to ignore that presence rather than reconciling to themselves that that creature really is them. They cannot do that because they do not have that sense of self. They cannot choose how to twist this sense of self to become whatever it is that they want. They are constrained by the dynamics of their environment. They're locked into particular trajectories they cannot escape from. A dog suddenly cannot decide that it's not going to be a dog anymore. Okay? It cannot do that. Its trajectory and dynamics are locked by that environment and by its own constitution. And these are the lessons that are engaged whenever Venus finds itself in Gemini. It must come to the realization that that Venus that is in Gemini exists as a dual construct. Me and another. And so that dynamic is the nature of relationshiping that exists between two people that are really mirror images of each other. There's only one person. So when you find yourself in a relationship, right, the Venus in Gemini has a tendency to flit from one relationship to another because that relationship exists as a mental construct to them. So it begins to go through the process that all mental constructs go to. It begins to derive pleasure from the presence of a thing and then its negation. And if it doesn't know that this is what it is doing, it will turn around and treat that negation as something that exists outside of itself. And then this sets up all sorts of dynamics that ultimately sound like a person arguing with themselves in the mirror. If you want to enjoy successful relationships, you must understand that this is what is taking place. You must understand your own nature, meaning what you actually bring into that relationship, because that's part of your life lesson when you have Venus in Gemini. In the meantime, learning these lessons, the Venus in Gemini placement is drawn to extremes of changeability and diversity. They enjoy such things in people. They enjoy it in themselves. It fascinates them. They are drawn to it. The speed of the mind, the diversity of the mind. They're drawn to the fluency of emotional anchors, which they can change almost as if at will. They can flit from one personal experience to another personal experience, as if such personal experiences never really meant anything per se. And it is because of that that some people have described them as superficial. Well, that's just a perspective, isn't it? Because they have the ability to connect with multiple realities simultaneously, which means that they're able to link narratives from different realities, spanning different people, and link them all together. And that way, the Venus in Gemini person has a unique perspective on the nature of their relationships. They have a thread of narrative that links every person in their reality. They can explain it all as part of some type of logical connection. Now, if you want to turn that into a gift, it's possible. If you want to turn it into a drag, it's possible, obviously. And everything depends on perspective. Everything depends on that self-awareness. Okay? Because as a human being, you always have the choice for constructive behavior or opposite. That's really what it is. They're very suited to fast-changing environments. They can deal with a multitude of people almost simultaneously. It's like having multiple conversations with different people simultaneously, and yet keeping track of every single conversation. They're not lost in the gibberish of it all. They're able to track what they're saying, even though they're talking to 6 different people at the same time. This is incredible. But it also goes to the point that they can have multiple relationships like that simultaneously. They can be engaged in 4 or 5 relationships simultaneously. It doesn't feel like anything to them, really. Alright? And yet it does. Because the Venus in Gemini person has this notion of what that Venus is, but it exists as a mental construct. They want it to exist as something more, and this drives them completely insane. It drives them to the point of frustration because they would like something real, concrete, and obstinate, loyal and determined, like that Venus suggests, but they cannot have it because it exists in their mind. So it exists as a construct that they cannot find actualization of in a physical reality. It can be very torturous. Okay? Now, as they grow older, transformations begin to occur. Because Gemini is symbolized as this restless caper that's always here, there, and everywhere. That's why Mercury is symbolized by its speed of association. right? But as they get older, they begin to calm down. They begin to understand their own nature, the deeper part of their own nature, and what they're actually bringing into different realities, as different realities. And that's where the transformations begin to occur. So that at some point in time, it becomes necessary to channel this aspect of the Geminian nature into some other type of constructive activity so that the Venus can rest. So that you find people who can be in long-term stable relationships as long as their reality contains something that can drain that Geminian energy in a constructive manner. This is the solution. This is why the placement, the functional light in that sign was given. And that is part of the narrative that is embedded within that natal chart. It's almost always the case, because when you have Venus in Gemini, what you have is like a windmill. Something that is turning very fast, like a vector that is spinning round and round very fast. That level of dynamism is always necessary to some other part of the chart that experiences blockages. Because ultimately, on the whole, the chart must be balanced in the sense that it must balance out for a functional good. That's really what it is. And so understanding what this goodness is, this functional goodness, and how it sits all over the natal chart, that is the point of natal chart synthesis. When all of these lessons are not learned, then the individual is in that Geminian mode, and they're constantly flitting from one activity to another, looking for how they can garner an advantage through some type of trickery or use of the mind, telling different types of stories to different types of people until they have created a vast web of deceit that they themselves are caught in. Because they've just told too many stories that are not true. They've said too many things that begin to contradict each other. And the moment these things begin to become called out, they disappear. That's how it works. It's their way of maintaining their sanity. Because if they stayed around, they would have to face the opposite of that vector, which is like looking at themselves in the mirror and then coming to terms with what they're actually doing. And most of them don't want to do this because it is very painful. What the Venus in Gemini really needs is a partner that understands this aspect of them, so that they must have an outlet for that energy. It's a mental energy. It's very restless. They must have a constructive outlet for it, so that when they come back into the relationship that they love, they're literally almost psychically exhausted. They just have enough of that restlessness to enjoy refreshing conversations and debates or whatever interpersonal relationships with their partner. But not too much to be restless, to want to go out there and seek something out there in the world from a Venusian point of view. Because remember, sex is also pleasurable. But the Venus in Gemini doesn't have sex because it's passionate and all that. Sex is more of a curious thing to them. They get into bed with people they find intellectually curious. People who have some type of wit about them. People who have some type of charm about them. Because that's their own nature. They are able to flit from one experience like that to another, but it never really means something deep. I mean, it never really translates into deep, passionate sex or love making or whatever, except that Venus is located in one of the water houses, right? Either in the 4th, the 8th, or the 12th house. Then it takes on deeper undercurrents, which further complicates the whole narrative, okay? But it's always related to the whole essence of the chart. Okay, that's why these things can never really be understood out of context. You cannot listen to a Venus in Gemini podcast and think that this explains your entire life. This is not true. That's your mind playing tricks on you. Your entire life really is an ensemble. It's a scheme that can only be understood as a whole. Now, what we're doing with these podcasts is to entice you with different aspects of understanding so that you begin to quest for the whole. That's really what it is. Okay?